So what we then do, and that's a typical scenario, what we then do is we say, all right, how can we get low pressures under the car, and how can we measure that we're actually achieving that? And if you look under most amateur race cars, I'm not that familiar with open wheelers, but certainly most sedan-based amateur race cars, their underside is just a dog's breakfast.
Welcome to the Your Data Driven podcast. If you like this podcast, be sure to visit our website at yourdatadriven.com for more useful help and advice on setting up your race car, mastering data analysis, and driving faster. Welcome to episode 48. Today I'm joined by Julian Edgar, all the way from Australia. Julian is an automotive journalist who's written a fascinating selection of books on suspension and aerodynamics. Today we discuss aerodynamics in a bit of detail, but what's absolutely fascinating is how we can translate some of the theory on aerodynamics into very, very practical things that you can go out and try for very low money. So without further ado, as ever, sit back, grab a pen, grab a coffee. Let's enjoy what Julian has to say. So, welcome, Julian.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, it's really kind of you to join us all the way from Australia. It's not often we get to talk to people from the other side of the globe. So thank you for taking the time. I'm actually really fascinated and excited about how this conversation is going to go. It's a subject around, well, we're going to talk a bit about aerodynamics on race cars and track cars. But it's a subject that it's one of those things for me as a vehicle dynamics engineer I've always had there in the background, and it's one of those ones you think, I know enough that I don't know enough about it, if that makes sense. And so what would be fascinating, I hope, for people listening is to get a bit of background on you and then some of the work that you've done, and it's extensive work that you've done in this world of aerodynamics. But what I love about it is it's so practically focused. Yeah, so you're not talking about multi-million pound CFD computers, although I know you're familiar with all that. And so what I'm hoping is that we can really work towards some takeaways. We've talked about that phrase a few times before the show, but just so that people can go away and actually either have a clearer idea of the aerodynamic development on their car. It's all what we hear about in Formula One all the time, but it doesn't really relate to them and their car. And maybe one or two things that they can go and try to put into action and put this stuff to good use. So how does that sound as a bit of a challenge? Are we good?
Yeah, no, look, that's absolutely fine. I tend to specialize actually in road cars and not so much in race cars. But of course, 90% of the techniques can be directly applied to race vehicles as well, especially those that run closed wheels. So not so much open wheelers, but especially closed wheels race cars. Basically everything that I can speak about can be applied to those vehicles as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, well, so this is it. And I suppose it's a little bit in terms of similar to my world in terms of suspension and such. Like it's it's the same equipment, but it just has a different purpose. But we can still learn from the different areas. For example, in a road car, the focus is very much on ride, but we can look at all of those parameters for comfort and flip them in a race car environment. And so actually those things are still relevant, even though we don't mind making the drivers uncomfortable if they get a bit more grip. So, well, let's roll back a bit. Let's roll back and start with a bit of background on you and your involvement in motorsport, or automotive, and tell us about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So my first career was as a school teacher. I was a school teacher for 8 years and enjoyed it, and I have kept teaching in various roles ever since. But about that time, after those 8 years, I started writing about cars for magazines and modified cars. And I found basically I was able to earn more money in writing about cars and their modifications rather than teaching. And so I transitioned into being an automotive journalist, worked as a magazine journalist here in Australia, national print magazine editor. And then
when you were teaching sort of those subjects?
No,
So is this just
not at all. No, I was a geography teacher. So I taught geography and natural resources management, history,
My
things of
mum
that
was a
sort.
geography teacher.
Up to senior school, and I enjoy it, and that's helped inform my view of the world ever since.
Yeah.
But when I started, in fact, just before I started being a journalist, I was becoming very interested in aerodynamics, and I read a seminal book of the time by Husho, a big German book that had been translated into English, and it made me quite intrigued. And I decided to do some testing on my own road car. And the testing that I did was Tuft testing. And what it showed in terms of the airflows on that road car were just mind-boggling how bad that car was. And I became quite intrigued with this. And the first 2 freelance articles I actually sold were on aerodynamics and aerodynamic testing. And so that began my 40-year interest in aerodynamics. And following Tuft testing, I then moved on to pressure testing, where you can actually measure the aerodynamic pressures that are occurring on different panels of the car. And then I moved on to downforce testing, where you can directly test downforce and lift on a car. And then I moved on to drag testing, which is probably the hardest of the 4, but you can still measure on the road or track variations in drag. And as this progressed, I was also writing books. And I wrote my first book on car aerodynamics, which was basically a summary of articles that I had published. And then I wrote another major book on aerodynamics, and this time I had the help of a professional automotive aerodynamicist, Dick Barnard, who was enormously helpful to me. And then in this sequence of events, earlier this year, I wrote a more major book on car aerodynamics. And the first book had become fairly well known, and so I was able to get the help of some really, really top aerodynamicists around the world. You mentioned Rob Palin, ex-Tesla and ex-Formula One. There's the book. But also Dr. Jeff Howe was enormously helpful. Dr. Thomas Wolfe from Porsche was helpful. Dr. Adrian Gaylard from Jaguar Land Rover. So I ended up having these incredible array of teachers helping me write this book. And if I have any knowledge of aerodynamics, a lot of it has come from my hands-on testing, but also from those experts who were absolutely eager to give freely of their time and their expertise.
So Rob Palin, just to fill you in on how I know Rob, I met Rob racing.
Sorry, there we are.
I
met Rob
racing. Yeah,
okay.
We used to compete against each other in this car very similar to the one you'll see behind me, or well, people can't see it, but that kind of Caterham style car.
Yes.
And for an aerodynamicist, I always thought it was really amusing that he had picked probably one of the least aerodynamic cars to race. He actually put it in the wind tunnel, and he told me reliably one time that it was had less drag going backwards than it did going forwards. And I was like, right, okay. Just so this is an interesting case study. Where do you go with that one? So what if you didn't have to rely on paddock folklore anymore? Get ahead of the curve. My weekly motorsports wisdom on driving, data and setup that you can read in just 5 minutes, completely free. Join thousands of dedicated racing and track drivers getting one article every Thursday. If you're enjoying this podcast, then Ahead of the Curve is for you. Subscribers are the very first to know about new episodes. Get deeper discussions, expert interviews, and behind-the-scenes racing stories. Head over to yourdatadriven.com and sign up for free today. Ahead of the Curve, where racing knowledge meets your inbox. And remember, you can also subscribe to the Your Data Driven podcast on any of your favourite podcast platforms. Yeah. Well, that's a fantastic story that you've been able to turn like passion and interest into this like your career in effect.
Yeah, look, as I say, it's been helped enormously by those people who've given their time and expertise. Rob read every chapter of the new book. He commented on every chapter, every paragraph. He is an extraordinarily blunt person in his comments, and it was delightful to be able to include a lot of his comments verbatim in the book. I think they'll open a few people's eyes. The angry bees of vortices is one of his phrases, for example. So he's poetic as well as being a brilliant aerodynamicist. And Rob, they broke the mold after they made Rob. He's been extremely helpful to me.
That's wonderful. So I've got some questions here, like, and I probably should. I mean, like, I probably should have picked this up over the years, but I haven't. So you mentioned sort of Tuft testing and stuff. What is that, and how do I? What am I actually kind of looking for? Like with these bits of wool sticking on the thing, because you said there are 4 different bits of the aerodynamics. So it was interesting you mentioned drag being the hardest one, because I think there's a lot of people who may not realise. I didn't realise that. So it'd be interesting to maybe go through some of those areas and then just sort of explore that a bit more, just in that practical sense of, you know, what can I do, and kind of is it even worth it? You know, is it worth me spending time on this?
So Tuft testing is the unsung hero of amateur aerodynamics and also professional aerodynamics. So Tuft testing has been used for over 100 years in the development of cars. If you look back at the development of cars like the Porsche 356, Lamborghinis and so on, you'll often see photos of Tufts being used on those cars.
What is a Tuft for the benefit?
Yep. So Tufts are small bits of yarn. So typically what I do if I need to produce 300 Tufts is I'll wind a ball of wool around 2 fingers, and then I'll cut through all the strands together. So you'll end up with a few hundred strands that are perhaps 50 millimeters, 2 inches long. You then stick them onto the car's bodywork, and typically you just use masking tape of the sort that's used when a car's being painted, so that you can take it off later without wrecking the paint. You can put your Tufts in rows, you can put them randomly, it really makes no difference. And then when you have tufted the area of the car you're interested in, you don't typically have to do the whole car. You might do one side and then down the center line, because the airflow is typically symmetrical either side of a longitudinal center line of a car. You drive the vehicle. Now, you can observe from the road or the trackside, you can photograph it from the road or the trackside, or you can photograph or video it from a tracking car. So all 3 approaches can be used. Now, a lot of people stop at that point. They see a car with fluttering Tufts and they think that they're achieving something, or you know, that this is going to result in an outcome, but they don't know what they're looking for. And in the movie,
I would hold my hand up at that point.
In the movie, Ford versus.
I'm still not 100% sure what I should be looking at, because they're one way or the other way. So what is it that I'm looking for?
So in the movie Ford versus Ferrari, or was it Ferrari versus Ford? I can't remember. They sort of drove this car around the track and then that was it. They didn't even observe what the Tufts were doing. So Tufts show 2 major aspects of airflow. The first thing that Tufts show is the direction of airflow. So for example, if you have a vent on a bonnet or hood, is the airflow going into that bonnet or hood vent, or is it coming out? So Tufts will quickly show that. When you have Tufts at the base of the windscreen, are the Tufts showing airflow going over the top of the windscreen, or are the Tufts showing lateral airflow going around the sides of the windscreen? So the very first thing that Tufts will show are actual airflow directions under real aerodynamic pressures and flows. The second thing that Tufts will show, and this is typically more important, is they'll show where airflow is attached and separated. So attached airflow is when the airflow is being guided by the shape of the bodywork. So the airflow across the bonnet or hood of a typical road or race car is attached flow, and the Tufts all line up, they flutter very little, and they line up all one after the other, pointing in the direction of flow. In attached flow, the bodywork is actually guiding the airflow direction. Now, the other type of airflow is separated airflow. So in this case, the airflow is no longer being guided by the bodywork of the car, it's going its own way. And Tufts in separated flow will flap wildly. Sometimes they'll point directly up from the bodywork at 90 degrees. Sometimes they will even point into the direction that you would expect the flow to be going. All right. So they're in random movement separated flow.
Just to roll back a second. So how do I think you mentioned it, but just to make sure I got that. So how do if I'm driving the car, how do I see the Tufts? Do you put cameras around, or are you driving next to it? I think you mentioned something about that, but just to make sure that I'm clear, because that was one of my questions. If I'm on my own, what do I do?
Yeah, if you're on your own, it's a lot harder. If you're on your own, you can use a GoPro or something like that, but then you run the risk of upsetting the flow with the presence of the GoFlow and the supporting structures. It's Tuft testing is typically best done with 2 people or even 3. One person to drive the car, one person to observe, photograph, video, and if you are using a chase car, a 3rd person to drive the chase car.
Oh, so you drive past someone. So I mean, they could, in practical sense, they could be on the pit wall, couldn't they? And then you
Yes.
drive past them. They just take some photos of the cars going past, and then right, okay. So then we can look at those photos afterwards, and then for the kind of features, or maybe a video or something like that, depending on.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Important thing to realize is you don't have to be going fast. You only have to be doing about 35 miles an hour, 60 kilometers an hour.
Oh, really?
You do not have to be going really fast. And of course, if you're only doing that speed, photographing, videoing, or following in a chase car becomes a lot easier. So you've got 2 types of flow. You've got separated flow, you've got attached flow. The really important thing to realize is if you have separated flow, there's not a lot you can do with it. So a wing positioned in separated flow won't be doing much. A spoiler positioned in separated flow won't be doing much. An under tray in separated flow won't be doing much. And so you use tufting to work out where you have your separated and attached flows. And what you're trying to achieve is attached flows, because then you can do something with the flow more readily than you can with separated flow. And also attached flows generally will typically give you lower drag. And so Tuft testing, while it sounds incredibly simple, and it is incredibly simple, because it can show you airflow directions and it can show you the presence of where there is attached and separated flow, is extraordinarily powerful. People way underestimate Tuft testing as a 0 cost, quick and easy way of actually seeing what's going on.
Wow. Okay. So, because you do see, and this is the naive bit of me looking at, I look at cars and people have made modifications and they're clearly trying to manipulate the aerodynamics in some way. They've changed the shape of, I don't know, in our case, the sort of the wheel covers, or there's work that they've done on trying to smooth things out, or there's work that they've done on adding some of these features that, like a spoiler or something like that they're hoping is going to add some downforce. And often the criteria for working out whether or not it's worked is the driver. And it's like, well, can the driver feel any different? And if you spent a lot of time and effort making something, there's a bit of a potential bias there in the thinking, like, oh, well, I think it made a difference. I don't know, but it's because you don't want to make it worse, do you? You don't want to make, like, we're all here. We want a faster lap time, right? We want a faster lap time with a more predictable car, so we're going to enjoy ourselves a bit more. And you don't want to make it worse than what you started, but equally, you wonder whether these kind of additions are actually working. And so what you're suggesting here with the Tuft testing is that you can use this very simple tool to try and work out, well, actually, yeah, it's making no difference, or it is making a difference.
There are actually better tools to see if it's making a difference or not. Tuft testing is almost the first tool. So let's find out where the airflow is going and whether it's attached or separated, because then subsequently we can make more logical decisions about what aerodynamic modifications to make. So it's the very preliminary.
Yeah, and then let's see. Right, okay.
So for example, let's say that we are running Tufts down the top of a car.
Yeah.
And let's say the transition from the roof to the rear window on a sedan-based race car is too steep. And therefore, we find we have airflow separation occurring at the end of the roof. Yeah. That would place the whole of the rear window and the whole of the trunk lid, boot lid, in separated flow. So we get to say to ourselves, okay, so a spoiler on the back of that trunk or boot lid will achieve very little. A wing to be in clean air is going to have to be pretty darn high. Okay, so we're not going to spend ages shaping a boot spoiler or trunk spoiler if in fact it's already in separated flow. Or, and much more interesting, is under the car, where you can achieve so much in terms of reducing lift and getting downforce. Under the car is where everyone who's an amateur should be working first. If we look under the car and we just have a massive separated flow, and then, you know, you do need to have a GoPro to see that, then you say, well, okay, gee, this is where we need to start putting in some work in order to give downforce. So Tuft testing, because it's free, because it's quick, because it's easy, and because it's so illuminating, is the very, very first aerodynamic test you should do. Yep. Whether you're developing a solar race car, whether you're developing a sedan-based race car, whatever you're developing, Tuft testing is the very, very first step.
Okay. And so, because what I've done a bit with, again, because it links with suspension, is having, and not everyone has this, but like a ride height sensor on the suspension, and you can kind of look at, like, okay, well, this is the pitch angle of the car as I'm driving along, and that, you know, that's influenced by, well, one of the influences is the aerodynamics. So you can adjust your aerodynamics and it adjusts your pitch. So would that be sort of the logical next step? Because those sensors can be quite expensive to add. So it's quite a big jump from notionally free ball of wool and a bit of tape to something else.
Yeah, downforce testing, which is what I use the suspension sensors for, is your third step. So your second step after Tuft testing gives you your global airflows, gives you your separated and attached flows, gives you airflow directions, right? Second test is pressure testing. And so all the lift and downforce, almost all of the drag, 80 to 90% of the drag, is caused by pressure variations over the car. Okay, so if you have a higher pressure on the top surfaces than you have on the bottom surfaces, you will get downforce. If you have a higher pressure on the bottom surfaces than the top surfaces, you'll get lift. If you have a higher pressure on the front of the car,
that's why you're saying so much work. You should focus on the underfloor of your car first, because you're basically rather than sort of, I suppose, just to explicitly say this, rather than thinking, oh, I need to push the car down with these wings, you're flipping that and saying, actually, if I create a low pressure zone under the car, it's going to suck itself down on the car, no matter what, on the ground, no matter what I've got on the top.
Not quite no matter what, but that's certainly a thing. But the point is that's being made is all these are pressures. Okay, the drag, the lift, the downforce are all based on pressures. And if we can measure those pressures directly, we can therefore work out what's going on, and we can work out what our modifications do. So what you would typically do as the second step after Tuft testing is you would do a measurement of centerline pressures, the centerline of the car along the top and along the bottom. Now, measuring aerodynamic pressures are very small, but measuring aerodynamic pressures is achievable, it's easy, it's accurate, and it costs under $100 if you buy a few secondhand bits. If you buy everything brand new, it's probably about $300. Now, that suddenly puts into the hands of any amateur the ability to see what normally can be seen only in a wind tunnel.
What is it? Just, and I forgive my naivety, but what sensor does the pressure?
Well, what we do.
I should know the answer to this. I'm thinking.
No. Very few people do. What's
it they're called? The pitot tubes and things, but that's not what we're talking about. Right?
It is. So what we need is, it's all done with no electronics. Okay, no electronics whatsoever. You can do it with electronics, but it just costs a great deal more. So what we need is a pressure sensing patch, which is like a little coin with a hole drilled in the top and a little tube that goes in the side. And you can make your own, and I'll show you how to make your own in the book, but it's cheaper and easier, or not cheaper, but certainly easier to buy a professional one. The skinny valve ones are extremely good. So you end up with this little coin style patch that you stick to your car, and because it's thin enough, you're actually measuring the surface pressure. So that's our pressure sensor. It's just a little patch with a hole in it, a little aluminium disc. Now, what we do is we run a tube from that into the cabin, and we connect it to a gauge. And it's a very, very sensitive pressure gauge, a differential gauge called a magnehelic gauge. And that has the ability to measure these very, very small aerodynamic pressures. But it's a differential gauge. It's measuring the pressure patch compared with something else. And if we compare the pressure with the cabin pressure, that's no good, because the cabin pressure is going up and down depending on your speed. So we need to compare the pressure we're measuring on the body surface with atmospheric pressure and we sense that through a pitot tube, through what's called the static ports on a pitot tube. Now, I use pitot tube, which is sold for use in model aircraft, $25. I use the pressure measuring patch from Scanivalve, I don't know, $10. I use the Magnahelic gauge, maybe $30. And so for under $100, you can measure the pressure at one point on the bodywork. Now, you would typically measure, say, 14 centerline pressures across the top of the car.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. And 3 or 4 under the car. So this is not a test that you can do in 30 seconds.
No.
It's certainly a test you can do in an hour. And then you know the body pressures on top, you know the body pressures underneath. Now, let's say we're measuring the body pressures on top and they're all fairly low, because they probably will be as the airflow wraps around the top of the car.
Yeah.
And then we're measuring the pressures under the car and they're not nearly as low. Oh, dear me, this car's got lift.
Yeah.
Right? There's lower pressures on top than underneath. So what we then do, and that's a typical scenario, what we then do is we say, all right, how can we get low pressures under the car and how can we measure that we're actually achieving that? And if you look under most amateur race cars, I'm not that familiar with open wheelers, but certainly most sedan-based amateur race cars, their underside is just a dog's breakfast. They might have this little...
That's an official term.
Yeah, it is. They might have this little under tray that goes for like 500 mils at the front, and they might have some fake diffuser stuck on the back, and it's as rough as anything in between.
Yeah.
And if we measure the pressures, we don't have to guess. If we measure the pressures, we'll see that the pressures under the car aren't very low, and that's because the airflow is not traveling fast. The faster the airflow, the lower the pressure. And if we've got really rough underside to a car, we're not going to get that fast airflow. And so
a lot of it gets sucked into the engine bay and it sort of all stalls in that area, and it's just blockages and things. Right. Okay. Yeah, I get this.
So well, actually the airflow coming out of the engine bay is causing a lot of your problems, because of course that's where most engine airflow comes out. It comes through the radiators, spills out under the car. All right. So you're really upsetting flow under the car. So if we say, all right, we'll put the car up on a hoist, we're going to put a full length under tray, smooth as we can make it from front to back. And then we're going to just lift it up a little bit at the back, a diffuser. It doesn't even need strakes, a little bit at the back. And now we're going to measure what the pressure is under the car. We will find it much, much, much lower than it was before. And that's pulling the car downwards. And because we're talking about such a big area, that's the key thing with aerodynamics. Your pressure multiplied by your area gives you your force. And if we're talking about many square meters under a car, we only have to get the pressure a little bit lower than atmospheric, and we're developing a much bigger force than we would, say, on a spoiler or even often a small wing.
And I think that's a really good point that you made. So you just dropped that in there like it's kind of common knowledge, but it's not. And I think one of the elements around using sort of engineering and maths and stuff to do anything to do with a race car is just to understand, for me anyway, it's a means to an end, to understand some of the sensitivities of the changes that we make. So it can be like we can change, I don't know, in my world, like the springs, or we can change the tire pressures or something like that. But and we know intuitively that that's going to make this kind of difference, hopefully. Yeah, if you've spent some time and looked at it and maybe read some of the stuff that I've done. But you don't necessarily know by what amount. Yeah, you don't know. It's like, well, so these are all great ideas, but where do I start? So that's really fascinating what you just said there about if you can make this area under the car, well, you've got a big area under the car, like most cars, yeah. But if you can make in effect, this working area just that little bit better, you'll get a significant contribution, much more than like the wings. That's fascinating. Yeah.
Well, it gets even better because you're measuring real pressures, you can do the calculations and actually work out how many kilograms of downforce you're getting under the car just by measuring the area you're working with and the pressure. And this gauge reads off the pressure. You just do a few calculations and you can say, okay, so a concrete example, I did a little front under tray on my front wheel drive hot hatch. And, something like 30 kilograms of downforce at 120 kilometers an hour just by getting the curve right under there. So you can actually quantify it quite easily. And so measuring pressures under the car, on top of the car, and then making modifications and measuring the change in pressure allows you to see exactly how effective what you're doing actually is. And so, for example, people go on a lot about what angle should the rear diffuser be. But all you do is you put a bit of plywood there and you just change the angle as you're measuring the pressures. And so you can very quickly work it out. What's the optimum angle for my car at my ride height just by measuring the pressure under the car and changing that angle?
So this is I'm so pleased you brought that up, and I'm going to talk about Rob again, because he used to he's like a master of sticky tape and cardboard, and and I was like, what do you mean? It's like, well, we've got these people like making all these carbon bits and pieces for the wind tunnel and stuff like that, and I'm out there with the cardboard and stuff, because I just want something quick that I can iterate on, and then once I've got a design that I'm comfortable with, then I go and make it out of carbon or aluminium or whatever, and I think that's a nice thing. So one of the things I talk about is going to it on a test day with a plan. And so in here, you can almost have a set of, you're trying to map your current car, and then you can use all your imagination and think, well, if it's like this, what kind of change would we make? And then you can kind of have that pre-done in bits of cardboard and sticky tape, and then see the effect of it. Because what's lovely though, because you're using a bit of data here, is that you can actually see, no, that's making no difference, or that has made some difference. That sort of bed that in a more permanent fix.
Look, absolutely. But with the sort of cars we're talking about, probably plywood, marine plywood rather than cardboard, we are developing some major forces on some of these under trays, even at like 100 kilometres an hour, or 80, 90, 100 is where I typically test these. Very easy to quantify it. Whatever force you get at 100, you have 4 times the force at 200. So if you're getting 50 kilograms at 100, you've got 4 times 50 at 200. So easy to work out what you would get at higher speed. But the beauty of what we're describing is you can immediately see if what you are doing is making things better or worse.
Yeah.
And it takes away the guesswork and the rules of thumb and copying what someone else does and assuming that will therefore make it better. And once you start doing this sort of testing, you soon realize that things aren't as people often say. So, for example, it's true.
I'm laughing because actually I read the intro to your book, and because you mentioned the folklore and the sort of the rules of thumb and such, and then basically that's my whole day job is to helping people with that from a suspension and a data point of view, perhaps, but it's exactly the same thing. And you just really want to release people from this kind of the guesswork, and often, like you say, so much stuff is counterintuitive.
Yes,
and you just and you wouldn't know that unless you take maybe a more scientific approach. And this is what we're talking about. It is a science experiment. People are put off a little bit by that idea, I think, because maybe they didn't enjoy science at school. But we are trying to iterate in a sort of objective way. But I focus on the confidence that you have in the decisions you're going to make on what changes you've got, rather than always having that question in the back of your mind about, well, kind of it looks right, or they said this, and I think I should copy them for that reason because they're doing well, so I'll copy them, but they may not understand it either.
I'll give you a concrete example. Many people will say that deep side skirts will improve the effectiveness of an under tray in terms of reducing pressure. On one of my road cars, it made absolutely no difference whatsoever. And I experimented with side skirts that came down low enough to nearly touch the road. On that car, and I'm not saying it will be the same on another car, on that car at that ride height, it made no difference. But I ended up using 2 curved strakes that went around the rear wheels, and that measurably reduced the pressure acting on the diffuser. In other words, it was better pulling the car down. So it's a concrete example where 2 hours of testing, in this case on the road with plywood and tape. And I didn't even have to move the measuring puck. So I just kept reading the gauge in the same place and made the changes. And that showed what would be.
Were you surprised? So just talk us through that process.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
There wouldn't be a test, an aerodynamic test I have ever done that I knew the answer before I did it. And that there are so many tests that you do where you look at the data that you've written down, or just read the meter and write it down, and you think, wow, I'm going to do that again because that doesn't seem to make sense. You do it again, exactly the same results are achieved. So the key point is your Tuft testing for your overview, but your pressure testing when you're actually seeing what's going on in terms of the forces causing lift, downforce, drag, and thrust. Because, of course, you can also get thrust on front surfaces of a car. So the opposite of drag. And those are the things. And if we move to the top of the car, we were talking about the bottom of the car, but if we move to the top of the car, you can just test different heights of rear spoiler and measure the pressure increase that's occurring on the bodywork ahead of it. And so you can actually say, well, I put a 30 millimeter spoiler there and it made X difference. I doubled it to 60 millimeters, but the pressure didn't double. Therefore I don't need to go for a bigger and bigger spoiler. One of that height is effective. And if we go to the front of the car, one of the tests I did for the book just stunned me. And that is, I was always a bit skeptical of front splitters as giving massive downforce, because if you look at them, you can only achieve on the top of the splitter what's called the stagnation pressure when the air is brought to a halt at the front of the car. And getting a really low pressure under the splitter looked to me to be a bit problematic. So I did some testing and it worked extraordinarily well. And in fact, Dr. Thomas Wolfe of Porsche was kind enough to point out why it works so well, and that is because you got very strong vortices occurring under the front splitter, and that reduced the pressure even more than I had expected. But that's an example.
Okay. Yeah,
that's an example of testing an aerodynamic device and actually seeing what it does. And in that case, I was very, very surprised. And I recount some of that surprise in the book. Thomas Wolfe pointed out to me that they always double bolted all the splitters in the wind tunnel after they lost a few.
Well, they've come off.
Yes. Double bolted was his expression when I was so surprised at how much downforce this little front splitter was actually giving on one of my test cars. So yes, I'm very often surprised, and I think that's good, because it shows that you never stop learning. There are always surprises when you do that testing.
I think it's and I think that's the thing. I mean, if you've been humbled enough over the years to sort of go, yes, this is going to happen, and then the exact opposite happens, it sort of humbles you immediately. And so from then on, it's just a case of, well, I think, strongly believe that this is the situation, but you're open-minded to it being completely different.
Yeah. So the third one, you've got Tuft testing, you've got pressure testing. The third one is downforce testing, where you directly test what downforce or lift the body's giving. And you mentioned suspension ride height sensors. That's I think the best approach for actually measuring downforce and lift. And in fact, it doesn't have to be expensive at all. If you use the potentiometer-based ride height sensors from a car with air suspension, they all have them fitted as standard. If you use one of those sensors, or one on the front or one on the back, and feed it a regulated voltage, you can simply measure ride height off with a multimeter. So it's actually very, very cheap. Now, if you're running a car with very stiff suspension, as most race cars would, you would typically have to fit softer springs while you were testing that. Only has to be at a reasonably, 100 kilometers an hour in a straight line.
Is that to sort of get the resolution?
You want the sensor, or you want the suspension. So let's take a step back.
Yeah.
If the car is developing downforce, the bodywork will compress the springs as you go faster. Ride height will get less as you go faster. Okay, and that's what we're measuring when we're measuring ride height with a suspension sensor. And if the springs are very stiff, then obviously the deflection as you go faster will be very, very small. I did have one person write to me once, and they were testing their road car, and they said, I can measure no downforce, and yet theoretically I should be getting a lot. And it turned out his suspension was so stiff that when his wife got in the passenger seat, there was no measurable suspension deflection. And so you've got, I don't know, 60, 70 kilograms or whatever getting in, and there's no measurable suspension deflection. then obviously you would have to have massive amounts of downforce to be able to measure anything. So you need to have suspension that's still got some movement when, you put in 30 or 40 or 50 kilograms. But and the other part of downforce testing using suspension ride height sensors is you have to smooth the signal. And in my book, I do some very simple electronic circuits that are smoothing circuits. If you've got a motorsport car and you've got an analog input into a digital dash, you can smooth it in the software, of course. But downforce testing,
just because it's quite noisy, and then you can filter.
Yeah. You want an average
that people can grab, Butterworth or moving averages, these kind of things, just to sort of smooth it out. Yeah.
I just use a very simple capacitor resistor smoothing circuit, which is really, really simple and really cheap to make and works quite well. Basically, you want to see that height settle, not be upset by all the bumps you're going over. But, if you do it well and you have rigid mounts for your ride height sensor and all that, has to be done mechanically as well as electronically, you can measure 1 millimeter changes in average ride height. And, that you then can quantify that. How many kilograms does it take to deflect your suspension by 1 millimeter at a slow speed compared with that fast speed? And it's a very, very effective way of doing it. I guess the other point that I'd make is if you don't want to fit a ride height sensor, you can use a laser sensor. So I use a laser ride height sensor as well that just looks at the road, but it sounds more elegant, but because tires grow with speed, you've got something else happening there as well, which makes it a bit more complicated. So I would prefer just to use a suspension ride height sensor. And so you can do your Tuft testing, you can do your pressure testing, you can then make your modifications based on the pressure testing results that should give you the downforce that you then measure with those sensors. So it's a sequence of events.
Got you.
Okay, so there's no jump. There's no random, let's try this and, look, it changed the ride height. It's actually a sequence of events which leads you almost certainly to be achieving those results that you want when you get to the downforce measuring stage.
So, and the other thing that sort of popped into my head as a handling kind of guy is the effect on your car balance with these things. Because I can imagine, by the sound of it, with your front splitter, you've got quite a lot more on the front now than you had at the back, and so the dynamicist in my head is going, oh my god, what happens when we get to a corner? So I guess there's rolling that all together, you're giving yourself some tools here to sort of balance both the overall contribution of lift or downforce or whatever the term people want to use for it, but also the balance of that front to rear, such that you're not, compromising your ability to drive around the corner. Because you want more downforce so you can go quicker, but equally it needs to be balanced.
There are some interesting complexities in that. So, for example, where is the downforce being developed? In a front splitter, it's been developed well ahead of the front wheels. The center of pressure is well ahead of the front wheels. And so you're causing lift at the back.
Yeah.
Okay. With a rear wing that's positioned rearwards of the rear wing, the rear wheels, you are causing front lift.
Yeah.
So you not only are changing overall downforce, you may be influencing the downforce at the other end. The other point that makes it really interesting is, let's say you've got an understeering car and you decide you want to give more front downforce to dial out that understeer. You then dial it out only on high-speed corners. What happens on slow-speed corners, where you're getting vastly less downforce from your aerodynamic attachments, then you have a pig understeer on low-speed corners. And let's say, okay, I'm going to fit a stiffer rear anti-roll bar to get rid of my low-speed understeer. All right, what happens at high speed? So really, the front and rear downforce that you're aiming for really has to largely match the weight distribution and the car handling at all speeds. Otherwise, you end up where you got quite different results at high speeds versus low speeds, because the forces go up much, much faster for aerodynamics. You see what I'm saying? It makes it rather interesting.
Welcome to my world. That's all I'm
Yeah.
going to say.
Well, I write about suspension as well, so I do a little bit on suspension as well as the aerodynamics. But this is germane, because on that little hot hatch I was talking about, when I gave it 30 kilograms of front downforce at 100, it was good at high speed, but at low speed it's understeered a great deal because it wasn't getting that downforce, you see, at the front. So anyway, I ended up making a rear wing for that car as well to get it a bit more balanced in both high and low speeds. And the rear wing is interesting because that leads me to my final testing technique, and that is testing for drag.
Yeah.
So drag testing is the most difficult of the four.
Is this sort of coast down stuff? You think?
Yeah, well, coast downs are very good unless you actually try and get it accurate. So coast downs are massively overrated. I know a lot of Formula SAE teams have used it in the past and swear by it. Just see what consistency you get. Do 10 coast downs and see what your scatter is, and you'll typically find the scatter is massive. And there are a few ways of improving coast downs. One is to do it from a very high speed to a lower but still very high speed, so the aerodynamic forces are dominating over rolling resistance. But I mean, we talked about Rob. Rob talked in the book about having to do 100 coast downs to get data that was valid. 100, and no one does 100.
So just for the benefit of people, I just realised not everyone may know what a coast down test is. I just sort of dropped it in there, but so my understanding of a coast down test is you drive along at a speed, and then you basically lift off and you wait, and then you monitor how the deceleration over time for your car. So between, I don't know, you're at 100 miles an hour and you go to 50, or maybe in your case you suggest go a bit quicker if you can, but so 100 miles an hour to 50, and then that gives you a gradient. And then the idea is that that's the drag. The only thing that's slowing you down is the drag, is my understanding of that. But what you're saying is that the variability in that can be quite significant.
Yeah, a few points. You're normally in neutral, not letting the engine slow you down. So you normally select neutral. And the other thing is, yes, you have your retardation, that force, but you've also then got to remove the effect of rotational inertia in the driveline, which is trying to push you along, and also frictional drag of the tires. And so you got a few figures in there that you suddenly have to get from somewhere and insert into the data. And in the book, Rob Palin actually has a whole page where he discusses the problems of data fitting curves in coast downs. It's a terribly imprecise way of doing it. And what I have found in my testing is that the ambient conditions just stuff it. All right, any slight crosswinds, and you never get dead calm days. Any slight crosswinds, and you get variations that are just enormous.
A friend of mine have just made a tunnel. Have you seen the tunnel, the Catesby tunnel?
Yeah, I have some concerns about the blockage factor in that tunnel, but that's maybe a topic for another time.
Oh no, it's quite small, isn't it? Yeah, so they just for the benefit of people listening, they've converted an old railway tunnel into a aerodynamic testing environment where you can just drive in, because you're in a tunnel. There's no crosswinds, or in theory, a much more controlled environment from ambient and temperature point of view. So just they're trying to deal with some of the issues that you mentioned there with doing this real world testing. So yeah. So
what I suggest people do is there are two effective ways of testing for drag variation. Neither of them will give you a drag coefficient. That can really only be determined in a wind tunnel, a full-size wind tunnel. But if you're testing for variations in drag, so you've put on a front spoiler or a rear spoiler or an under tray, and you want to see what the difference is in drag, there's two main ways of doing it, which I think are accurate. And one takes forever, and that's fuel consumption testing, mileage testing, where, you do 400 laps or whatever it might be.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, that's going to take a while, yeah.
And the other approach, the one that I've come up with, which is very effective, is what I call throttle stop testing. So the approach is you limit engine output to a small value, and then you measure the change in top speed with different aerodynamic variations. And so, for example, it's called a throttle stop testing because you can literally use a throttle stop. and you might limit throttle to 10%. What is your top speed at 10% throttle on a straight level road or track where you reach your terminal speed and it just sits there? And that's the key point. It sits there. So typically when I'm testing on the road, I set the throttle stop so that it gives me 100 kilometers an hour. So I can stay within local speed limits, and it'll stay at, this is a GPS measured, it'll stay at 100, 100.5, 100. It'll just stay there. Okay. And then you go back to the beginning, you do another run. And unlike coast downs, it'll be 100, 100.5 the second time around, the third, the fourth. It's extremely consistent. Now, if you're doing throttle stop testing and your second run unchanged is 104 or 95, you're not doing it right. You've got too many variations. But if you get it to well within 1% on repetitive throttle stop testing with no aerodynamic changes, you're onto a good thing. Then you make your aerodynamic change. You put on your under tray, you change the angle of your wing, you do whatever you want, and you do it again. And you will very often see a change in speed. If you've reduced drag, the speed will be higher. I said 100 before, it might be 102. If you've increased drag, the speed will be lower. And if you want to really see the effect, adjust the rear wing, and so it becomes an air brake. And as you increase the angle of the rear wing, A then becomes stalled, and then B becomes stalled in the air brake. You'll watch that terminal speed just drop away. Okay, it's a dramatic increase in drag, and so there's a dramatic decrease in terminal speed. So throttle stop testing won't show you variations in drag of less than a couple of percent, and then that's a disadvantage. But any change in drag that's greater than a couple of percent will typically show up with throttle stop testing. And the other point to make, of course, is you have to be using an engine where a fixed throttle angle gives you a fixed output. So if you have a hybrid car or something like that, all sorts of electronic active throttle control, a fixed accelerator pedal angle might not necessarily give you a fixed throttle blade opening. So you need to be aware that that's not changing.
So you can't. So just to recap on that, because I love that one. I remember reading about that in your book. It was like, and I'm glad you've explained it, because it didn't, because it was kind of new. I was like, I didn't quite understand. So now I do. Well, I think I do. So let me repeat it back to you to see if I have understood it. How about that? So the idea is that you have a fixed throttle position which you can use with a throttle stop. Hopefully, some people have got adjustable ones, so you can position it so that your throttle position is always in the same place. You drive along, I don't know, third or fourth gear in that at that throttle amount up to a velocity or a speed that's reasonably quick. So sort of like you're not going to do this at 10 miles an hour, are you? You're going to be. It needs to be sort of what?
So the highest possible gear, so that the engine speed is relatively low, and as fast as you can. Like if you are in a location where you can do 150 kilometers an hour, you set the throttle stop so you can get to 150, but you have to have room to hold it at that speed. Now, if you throw
how
in
long
corners,
are you holding it for? How long are you holding?
10 seconds, just enough to see it's actually settled, or that it's holding it, it's not changing. So if you've got corners, you're going to, scrub off speed on the corners. That won't be any good. It has to be straight, and it has to be a repeatable. It doesn't have to be dead level, because you can come back to the beginning each time through the repetitive ones. And furthermore, and this is perhaps extending the idea, furthermore, it doesn't even have to be still conditions, because if you do this testing in windy conditions, gusty windy conditions, you can see the aerodynamic drag that's occurring in real world yaw wind, in other words, in crosswinds. And that is fascinating, because there's a whole bunch.
Almost like its own test, isn't it, in its own right?
Yeah.
You're not even trying to change the car. You're just trying to see how sensitive it is when it's had these conditions.
Even if you do change the car. So I'll give you a concrete example. Air curtains are used on all modern cars to reduce front wheel drag. So an air curtain.
What's an air curtain?
Is a slot at each side of the front bumper, and it feeds air through to a slot in front of the tyre, and that directs air around the tyre, therefore giving better flow attachment on the rotating wheel, and also better flow attachment on the panel behind the wheel. Now, take air curtains, fantastic. If you do testing, you'll find that with no yaw, with just going straight into the wind, they work, but not greatly. But if you add a yaw component, a crosswind component, you'll find the air curtains make a dramatic difference to how well the flow stays attached behind the wheels and the side panels. And if you do throttle stop testing with air curtains in place and blocked, you can actually often see a difference in speed if it's a windy day, not if there's no wind. So yeah, people talk about wind tunnels. Wind tunnels have got very little turbulence. They sometimes have yaw because they position the car at an angle, but often not. Okay. Whereas testing in this description, in this approach on a windy day, you're actually testing everything for real. And that's what makes it so exciting and interesting and more difficult. You know, I know why manufacturers use wind tunnels. It's such a controlled environment. But here, you're out in the real uncontrolled environment, which is our reality, in which we live, work and play and drive cars. And so it's very, very interesting to do it that way. So, yeah, high gear. If you can go faster than 100, by all means do so. If you can do 150 and have room to reach that terminal speed, do it 150. Great. All the aerodynamic forces are greater, so you're going to see bigger changes. Yeah. But it has to be repeatable. You know, you have to do 4 or 5 runs where you've made no change to the car and you're getting almost exactly the same speed, and you will be able to achieve that if you do your tests in exactly the same way. So for me, I've got a local bit of straight road, which has now been largely bypassed by a freeway. So I head off to my local bit of straight road. I accelerate from a tree on the next to the road. I reach the speed at which I move to the throttle stop opposite another tree. And then at a tree about a mile down the road, I read my speed. Now, that all might sound rather basic, but it means you can do the test identically every single time.
And that's the main thing for any testing, isn't it? Just that repeatability. Because you want to make sure that the numbers you're looking at are reliable. So that's and you know, look, if I'm doing lots of testing, I might lose concentration. Oh, damn, I missed the tree. Oh well, I'll turn around and go back to the beginning. You know, I missed the point at which I moved to full throttle. So this testing, I have had people write to me and said, you know, I've tried your throttle stop testing and the speeds are all over the place. And I say, well, how did you do it exactly? And they say, I don't know, I just drove down the road. And that won't work. This is the trickiest test. Of the 4 tests that I've described, this is by far the trickiest. Yeah. But the throttle stop testing, I'm confident is very effective. And incidentally, if you are testing a car, here's a really easy way of seeing you're on the right track. Let's say it is a road car. Do your tests and then wind all the windows down and do another test. And you will find the drag has gone up considerably, typically around 10% with all the windows down, and you'll see that difference in the speed. So it's an easy way of seeing if you're on the right track. It's almost like another calibration you can do, isn't it? In a way, you can sort of go, right, you know, where are we today? It's really, and you know what, from a motorsports point of view, I mean, the irony of this is it actually brings us closer to what we want. Like, we don't really care about drag coefficients. We care about going faster in a straight line. Sure. You know, we'll care about going faster around the lap, you know, and so this is quite explicit in a way, because you can go, well, this is as fast as my car can go, or, you know, or within, you know, repeatable environment. And I'm doing all this work and it's not making any difference to my top speed, or it has made a difference to my top speed. Therefore, and one of the things is from a learning point of view, and this is another point that I try and make all the time, is that even if it doesn't make a difference to your top speed, that you've still learned something. And it means you can kind of forget about that and move on to something else. Yeah. Otherwise, what I've seen it so often is that people have these sort of nagging pet projects in their mind that they get obsessed about. They really want to like pursue something, and for whatever reason, they're frustrated by or they optimize into a cul-de-sac in a way. And in this sense, it's kind of like, I mean, my car, it would be an interesting exercise, but I have a feeling that it's not going to make, well, my hypothesis would be it's not going to make a huge amount of difference because it's so bad to start with, and we're so limited on what we can change. So
There are race cars where drag makes a huge difference. Solar race cars, low drag solar race cars, human powered vehicle racing, and also Bonneville, Salt Lake, high speed events. Drag makes an enormous difference to the performance in each of those cases. And this is a technique where, especially when you're going in a straight line or you're very limited in the power that's available, you can make noticeable and I would suggest even dramatic changes in what can be achieved. So again, depends what type of racing you're looking at. If you're going around lots of corners, reducing drag is going to be a lot less important than gaining downforce. But if you're going largely in a straight line or you're very limited in available power, then reducing drag is very, very important.
Oh, this has been absolutely fantastic. I could talk to you all day about this. I mean, because it's two things. There's these actual very practical things that I'm hoping anyone listening can go away and try and do, but also that the mindset side of it, in the sense of just trying to understand, well, why are we doing this? And we're not, again, like, just to reiterate that sort of sensitivity side of things. It's like, well, yes, it's not going to make it worse, but there are other things that might be better off for your time and investment and things like that. So, but what's nice is you'll be able to quantify some of these things. And I think that's so refreshing. So look, I'm just looking at the time. Thank you again for taking the time to join us and share this fascinating process and knowledge. I just really appreciate it, and I'm sure everyone listening will. We'll see a lot more cars with there'll be a run on balls of wool at the local knitting shop.
I hope so.
Sure.
I hope so. It's the most intriguing testing you can do, and if you haven't Tuft tested, to all those people listening, it really is extraordinarily informative and very easy and very cheap.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you very much.
Thank you.
A privilege to have someone as enthusiastic as Julian on the show. For him to share in such detail the step-by-step ways you can go and try and improve the aerodynamics of your car. I think it's absolutely fascinating what he has proposed and suggested. So I hope it should be a run on wool and all sorts of pressure testing kit in the near future. If you give it a go, be sure to let me know how you get on. And I hope you very much enjoyed this episode. You may know that at the end of season 1, I wrote the Motorsports Playbook, a summary distilling the first 20 shows into nuggets of wisdom. I made the notes so that you don't have to. If you've not got it yet, go and grab yourself a copy from the website. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at yourdatadriven.com.